Welcome, dear listener, to the quiet lanes and rose-covered cottages of St. Mary Mead, that most quintessential of English villages. Life here appears simple enough. Gardens to tend, teas to pour, and parish meetings to attend. Yet beneath the lace curtains and polished tea sets lies a world of secrets, whispered quarrels, and human folly. And who better to uncover them than our very own Miss Jane Marple? With her knitting needles and keen eyes, she notices what others overlook. Chapter 1. The Shadow of a Will. The summer sun lay gently across the tiled rooftops of St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across hollyhocks and the cobblestone lanes that wound their way about the village like a pattern in a well-worn quilt. The air smelled faintly of lavender and honeysuckle, and the hum of bees could be heard in the gardens where roses, fat and velvety, drooped heavily from their stems. It was, by all outward appearances, a day like any other. A day for polishing brass, tending to chickens, or enjoying a quiet cup of tea. But in the post office, where tidings both grand and trivial were exchanged with every stamp and parcel, a murmur had begun. A murmur that was to grow into something far larger, something that would set tongues wagging and eyes glancing sideways for weeks to come. Miss Jane Marple, that quiet and deceptively fragile old lady with snowy hair and hands always engaged in her knitting, happened to be present when the first whispers reached the ears of St. Mary Mead. She had come to collect her letters, 2 bills, a circular from a seed company, and a postcard from her nephew Raymond in London. When Mrs. Hartwell, the postmistress, leaned confidentially across the counter. "You've heard the news, Miss Marple? About poor Reverend Harrow?" Miss Marple, adjusting her spectacles, looked up with a mild expression. "Indeed I have not, Mrs. Hartwell. Has something happened?" The postmistress lowered her voice, though she was keenly aware that Mrs. Price, the grocer's wife, was pretending to study a display of envelopes nearby, her ears undoubtedly straining. "He passed away yesterday afternoon. Peacefully, they say, in his study bureau. Yet when the solicitor came yesterday, there was no such document to be found. The only will on record is the one made years ago, leaving everything to his nephew, Mr. Henry Harrow. But they say, though I won't vouch for it, that in the new will the Reverend intended to leave his estate to that young curate, Mr. Fielding." A gasp went up from Mrs. Price, who clapped her hand to her bosom. "To the curate? Whatever for? The nephew will be fit to be tied." Miss Marple did not gasp. She merely adjusted her knitting bag, her eyes thoughtful. A new will, vanished without a trace. Human nature, she reflected, was rarely so tidy as it liked to appear. Where there was money, there was motive. Where there was motive, there was often folly. Later that afternoon, seated by her window with her needles clicking softly, Miss Marple allowed her thoughts to drift back over Reverend Harrow's life. He had been vicar of St. Mary Mead for over 3 decades, a man of gentle temperament and old-fashioned views. His sermons were rarely fiery, but often full of kindly admonitions about patience, humility, and charity. He was not a man one would think of as having enemies. Yet, as Miss Marple knew better than most, one need not have enemies to stir up discord. A change in a will was quite enough. The Reverend had lived modestly, though not without means. The vicarage was a handsome old house with mullioned windows and ivy climbing the walls. He possessed a small inheritance from his family and had never married, leaving his estate unencumbered by dependents. His only close relative was his nephew Henry, a solicitor in London. Everyone had assumed Henry would be the natural heir. But then there was the curate, Mr. Julian Fielding, recently come to the parish, earnest, soft-spoken, and much admired for his tireless work among the poor. It was easy to see how a man like Reverend Harrow, with no children of his own, might come to regard the young curate with a paternal fondness. The village, however, saw matters differently. They saw intrigue. They saw reasons and suspicions. To her jaw, as if she anticipated suspicion. Next was Mr. Julian Fielding, the curate. Pale, almost scholarly in appearance, with large spectacles and nervous hands, he sat quietly, his eyes lowered, as though the very weight of the occasion pressed upon him. Finally, there was Mrs. Lydia Carstone, a wealthy widow and generous benefactor of the parish. She swept in, clad in costly black silk, a small veil over her eyes, and carried herself with a mixture of dignity and self-importance. The solicitor, a Mr. Pritchard from the nearby town of Much Benham, cleared his throat and began. Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that after a thorough search, no recent will has been found among the Reverend's papers. The only document of record is the will dated some 15 years ago, which leaves the entirety of his estate to his nephew, Mr. Henry Harrow. Unless another testament should appear, that will stands. There was a murmur around the room. Henry Harrow's lips curved in a thin smile of satisfaction, though he attempted to school his features. The curate gave a sharp intake of breath, his eyes full of dismay. Mrs. Price clutched her handkerchief tightly, while Mrs. Carstone's mouth curled into a faint, unreadable smile. Miss Marple, seated a little apart, observed them all through her lace-framed spectacles. The curate's genuine shock, Henry's poorly concealed relief, Mrs. Price's anxiety, and Mrs. Carstone's curious calm. All these were like stitches in a pattern. Each must be considered, compared, and fitted into place. When the proceedings ended, Henry Harrow rose briskly. Well, that settles it then. The estate passes to me, as it should. I shall see to matters at once. His tone was clipped, efficient. Mrs. Price dabbed her eyes. But, sir, the Reverend did make a new will. I saw him seal it myself not a week past. He put it in the bureau in his study, I swear it. Henry gave her a sharp look. Nonsense, woman. You must be mistaken. My uncle was an old man, confused, perhaps. No such document exists. Her lap. She had said very little, but her eyes had missed nothing. The faint scratches around the lock of the bureau, the curate's trembling hands, the widow's peculiar calm, all were details to be filed away, to be examined later in the quiet of her cottage. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple rose with a gentle smile. Thank you, Mrs. Price, for inviting me. It is always so important to understand human nature at such moments, don't you think? Mrs. Price, still dabbing her eyes, looked bewildered. I suppose so, Miss Marple. Yes, said Miss Marple thoughtfully, adjusting her shawl. For when human nature is stirred by grief and by the prospect of money, one never knows what truths may come to light. And with that she stepped out into the soft summer air, the quiet of St. Mary Mead around her, but her mind already busy with questions. A new will had existed, that much seemed certain. But who had removed it, and why? And was it perhaps more than the Reverend's estate that lay hidden in the vanished document? Miss Marple, with her knitting folded neatly under her arm, walked slowly home, her eyes on the roses blooming along the lane, her thoughts on the deeper thorns of human behavior. Chapter 2. Suspicions in the Parish. The morning after the gathering at the vicarage, St. Mary Mead was already humming with speculation. In the lanes, behind clipped hedgerows, and in the snug kitchens where kettles sang, the subject of the missing will overshadowed all other conversation. Even Mrs. Bartlett's runaway hens, which had caused quite the scandal the previous week by scratching up the Colonel's vegetable patch, were forgotten in the face of this new drama. In such a village as St. Mary Mead, news never merely traveled. It blossomed, grew tendrils, and entwined itself with imagination until the simplest fact was transformed into a story of intrigue. By the time Miss Marple walked down to the grocer's shop that morning, it was already being said that the will had been stolen by burglars, or perhaps destroyed by the Reverend himself in a fit of senility. Miss Marple, serene and unhurried, kindly hand on the woman's arm. "Yes, my dear. After so many years in his service, it must be like losing a member of your own family." Mrs. Price sniffed, dabbing her eyes with a well-worn handkerchief. "That it is, miss. He was always so good to me. Not one for extravagance, but kind. That's why I can't understand it, why he wouldn't leave me something in his will. Not that I expected riches, you understand. Just a remembrance. 20 years of keeping his house, scrubbing, mending, baking. One gets attached." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Quite natural. And you are quite certain he had written a new will?" Mrs. Price's eyes lit with a sudden intensity. "Oh yes, miss. I saw him with my own eyes. He had it all written out, pages of it, and I watched him seal it in an envelope with red wax. He put it in the top drawer of his bureau in the study. He even locked the drawer. And now it's gone." She lowered her voice, leaning closer. "And if you ask me, Miss Marple, someone's been meddling where they oughtn't. That lock had scratches on it. I may not be clever, but I know what I see." Miss Marple's lips pursed ever so slightly, though her expression remained kind. "Indeed, Mrs. Price, I dare say you see far more than some give you credit for. A housekeeper, after all, observes much in silence." Mrs. Price gave a grim little nod. "That's true enough, miss." Later that same day, Miss Marple encountered Henry Harrow striding down the high street, his black coat flapping and his cane tapping impatiently against the stones. He greeted her politely enough, though his manner was brisk, his eyes cold. "Ah, Miss Marple. You were at the vicarage yesterday, I believe. Most unfortunate business. Still, at least matters are clear now. I shall do my duty by the estate." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Such matters are never quite as simple as they appear, Mr. Harrow. You must find it a burden, inheriting unexpectedly." Henry gave a short laugh. "A Reverend's grave, which had been freshly dug and planted with white lilies. His young face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he brushed soil from his cassock. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," said gently. Miss Marple said gently. "You have been very busy, I see." He looked up, startled, and removed his spectacles to polish them with a handkerchief. "Ah, Miss Marple. Yes, I couldn't bear to leave the grave untidy. He was more than a vicar to me. He was a mentor, a guide." His voice caught. Miss Marple laid a kindly hand upon his arm. "I know you must feel his loss deeply, and perhaps more so with this unpleasant business of the will." At that he flushed. "It is not the money, Miss Marple. Truly it is not. But he told me he wished me to continue his work, that the parish must be cared for. He spoke of endowments for the poor, and funds for repairs to the church roof. If the estate passes entirely to Henry, none of that will be done. Henry has no interest in the parish, only in his own affairs. Miss Marple observed him closely. His earnestness seemed genuine, yet there was a tension in his manner, a nervousness not entirely explained by grief. Was it guilt? Fear? Or merely the anxiety of a young man who saw his future slipping away? Human nature is often tested in times of inheritance, she said softly. It is no reflection upon you, dear Mr. Fielding, that others may suppose motives where none exist. He lowered his head. Yes, I know, but I should never have spoken of it yesterday. It made me look calculating. And I assure you, Miss Marple, I had no hand in that missing will. Miss Marple smiled gently, though she gave no assurance. She had learned long ago that people's protests of innocence were rarely proof of anything, though sometimes they revealed more than they intended. The widow's calm. That evening, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at Mrs. Bantry's, where tea was poured, and the ladies of the village discussed the matter with relish. Among them was Mrs. Lydia Carstone, Harrow. Miss Marple, seated quietly in her corner with her knitting, watched the widow's gloved hands as they smoothed her skirt, the faint curve of satisfaction at her lips. There was eagerness beneath the calm, an eagerness to influence, to control. She noted it carefully. Threads of suspicion. By the end of that week, Miss Marple had gathered impressions of them all. Mrs. Price, devoted yet wounded by neglect, certain she had seen the missing will. Henry Harrow, outwardly efficient, inwardly desperate, with debts he dared not name. Mr. Fielding, sincere and grieving, but anxious, perhaps too anxious, about how others perceived him. Mrs. Carstone, outwardly calm, inwardly calculating, eager to steer events for her own designs. Each had reason, in one way or another, to benefit from the disappearance of the Reverend's New Testament. As she sat by her fire one evening, the needles clicking steadily, Miss Marple reflected, when one drops a stitch in knitting, it may seem a small thing, easily overlooked. Yet the pattern reveals it sooner or later. So it is with human nature. Sooner or later a flaw will show. She sipped her tea, set down her cup, and gazed into the fire. Somewhere in the quiet village, among the familiar faces she had known so long, someone had meddled with the Reverend's last will. It was perhaps a small crime compared to others she had seen, but in its way, it was every bit as revealing of human folly, and just as certain to come undone, if one knew where to look. And Miss Marple, with her patient eyes and her unassuming manner, knew precisely where to begin. Chapter 3. The Reverend's Secrets. The vicarage was still shrouded in the hush of morning when Miss Marple arrived the next morning, her step light upon the gravel path. She had brought with her a basket of scones, neatly wrapped in a linen cloth, as much an excuse to call as an act of kindness. The ivy upon the old stone walls fluttered gently in the breeze, and in the flower beds the Reverend had tended with his own hands. The roses seemed to nod their heads mournfully. Mrs. Price is at rest. He smiled as if a great burden had been lifted. And then it vanishes as though it never existed. Miss Marple took a sip of tea, her eyes thoughtful. Tell me, Mrs. Price, did he mention what changes he had made? The housekeeper shook her head. Not in detail, ma'am. But I gathered it was to do with Mr. Fielding, and perhaps something for me as well. Though I don't like to say it, seems grasping. Still, he'd always been considerate. She lowered her voice, leaning closer across the table. But there's more. The night before he passed, I heard raised voices in his study. The door was closed, but I'd gone to fetch his medicine. It was Mr. Henry, his nephew. He was angry like I've never heard. Talking about disgrace, about exposure. And the Reverend, he said something about duty, about setting things right. Then I hurried away. I didn't want to be caught listening. Miss Marple's eyes, pale and sharp, rested on the housekeeper's flushed face. "That is very interesting, Mrs. Price. And you are quite certain it was Henry's voice?" "As certain as I'm sitting here, Miss Marple. I'd know his sharp tones anywhere." Miss Marple set her cup down gently. She knew from long experience that arguments behind closed doors often left deeper marks than their participants imagined. Reverend Harrow, mild though he seemed, had clearly been embroiled in something weightier than parish sermons. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered young Mr. Fielding in the churchyard once again, where he lingered near the yew trees. His expression was haggard, his shoulders bowed. When he saw her, he attempted a smile, but it wavered. "Miss Marple, I am ashamed of myself," he confessed, almost at once. "Yesterday I spoke too openly, before the solicitor and everyone. It was unseemly. To claim knowledge of a will that cannot be found, well, I fear it made me look self-interested." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "You spoke in grief and in honesty. The two often tangle themselves together. But if you truly knew of this new will, then it is important that you say so." He sighed, clasping his hand. Disappointment. A will changed in consequence, and then the will vanished. But there were other pieces still to consider. That evening at Mrs. Bantry's, the matter arose once again. Colonel Bantry declared stoutly that Henry was the rightful heir. Blood's blood, he insisted. Dashed nonsense, cutting out one's only nephew in favor of a curate. What do young fellows know about managing money? His wife disagreed. "You're forgetting, Arthur, that the Reverend was devoted to Julian. Everyone could see it. And if Henry had disgraced himself in town, as some say, then perhaps the Reverend acted quite wisely." Miss Marple listened with her usual quietness, though her mind was far from still. She thought of Henry's sharp words, of Mrs. Price's anxious manner, of Mr. Fielding's guilty eagerness to explain himself. And she thought, too, of Mrs. Lydia Carstone, for at that very moment the widow herself arrived, sweeping in with her rustling silks. She greeted the company warmly, then declared, "I only wish to see the Reverend's intentions honored. If Mr. Fielding is left without, then I shall do my utmost to support him. One cannot have the parish suffer for the sake of family quarrels." It was nobly said, yet Miss Marple, watching closely, noted the quick glance the widow gave toward Colonel Bantry as she spoke. Lydia Carstone was a woman who enjoyed being seen as generous. She had, Miss Marple recalled, a tendency to press her views upon others under the guise of benevolence, and her interest in the curate seemed perhaps a trifle too warm. When at last Miss Marple returned to her own cottage, she set aside her knitting and took up a small notebook where she jotted her private observations. She did not write names, she had no need. She wrote only small clues. Will sealed with red wax. Locked drawer. Scratches on lock. Quarrel, Henry. Duty, disgrace. Fielding told of change. Lydia eager. Price anxious. Pattern forming. She closed the book and set it aside. On the surface, life carried on. Children played in the lanes. Mrs. Hartnell barked her usual complaints about rationing. and Miss Weatherby at the post office distributed letters with her customary air of being privy to the innermost secrets of the entire parish. Yet beneath that surface ran a current of unease, like a stream flowing under winter ice. The disappearance of Reverend Harrow's new will was on every tongue, though spoken of in lowered voices as if the stone walls of the cottages themselves might listen. And into this quiet disquiet moved Miss Marple, never obtrusive, but always listening, always watching. It was at the morning service that the first ripple of doubt stirred within her mind. The curate, Julian Fielding, read the lesson with his usual clear voice, but Miss Marple noted that he stumbled slightly upon the words, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth." A simple slip, perhaps, but his face flushed deeply, and his hands trembled as he turned the page. Miss Marple, who had made a life study of nervous gestures, thought to herself, "A man conscious of accusation will often stumble at words that touch upon his fear." After the service in the churchyard, a knot of villagers had gathered. Mrs. Bantry, well wrapped against the chill, was speaking animatedly to Mrs. Price, who still wore her mourning black for the late Reverend. Miss Marple approached at her own unhurried pace and found herself drawn into their conversation. "It is extraordinary," Mrs. Bantry declared. "Simply extraordinary. A new will one day vanished the next. Why, my dear, if one read such a thing in a novel, one would call it far-fetched." Mrs. Price pressed her lips together. "All I know is what I heard. Mr. Henry was in a passion that night, and the Reverend was most distressed afterward. And now, with the will gone, who stands to gain? Why, Mr. Henry himself." At this pronouncement, Miss Marple observed a curious shift in the circle. Several heads nodded eagerly, but one person, a figure leaning slightly on her walking stick, spoke with sharpness. It was Mrs. Hartnell. "I admired the Reverend greatly, and I esteem Mr. Fielding highly, but I need no parish will to dictate my benevolence. If the will is lost, I stand to gain nothing, except perhaps a little freedom from gossip." Miss Marple, watching this exchange with her usual gentle detachment, noted how swiftly suspicion shifted from Henry to Lydia Carstone in the villagers' minds. It was always thus in human affairs. The pendulum of blame swung easily. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mr. Pritchard, the solicitor. His office, tucked away on the high street, smelled of musty leather and old paper. He received her with the courtesy due to an elderly gentlewoman of St. Mary Mead, though Miss Marple knew well that solicitors, like doctors, often considered spinsters to be curious creatures, prone to fuss. She wasted no time on pleasantries. "Mr. Pritchard," she said, "it is clear to me that the Reverend's new will was of some importance. It was, I believe, properly witnessed and placed in a sealed envelope. May I ask, was there anything unusual in the instructions he gave you?" The solicitor frowned slightly. "Well, Miss Marple, the Reverend was a thoughtful man. He seemed determined to amend his testament quickly, and I did sense, how shall I put it, a moral urgency about the matter, as though some circumstance had arisen that weighed heavily on him. But as to the details, I can only say that the document was deposited with him. When I returned to his study after his passing, the envelope was gone." "Gone," repeated Miss Marple softly. "Not mislaid?" "Most assuredly not. It had been locked in his drawer, of that I am certain. And the lock, well, I found fresh scratches upon it, as though someone had forced it in haste. Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful. A lock forced in haste. A will vanished. That much was clear. Yet the solicitor added something more. There was also, I must confess, a curious matter. A second envelope, sealed likewise with red wax, which was still in the drawer. "Bantry, you'll never believe it, Dolly," he exclaimed. "But I've had it from young Davis at the inn. Henry was seen late at night, the very night of the Reverend's passing, slipping into the churchyard. Said he was going to see to a matter of importance. Now, what do you make of that?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes gleamed with excitement. "Mary, what do you say? Doesn't that prove Henry took the will?" Miss Marple's needles moved steadily. "It proves, dear Dolly, only that Henry went into the churchyard, which may be of great significance, or of none at all. Young men, when in difficulty, often pace about at night. It clears the mind, you know. And besides, if one wished to conceal the removal of a will, would one announce it so clumsily at the inn?" Colonel Bantry harumphed, clearly dissatisfied. But Miss Marple's thoughts were already far away. A churchyard at midnight. A will vanished. A sealed note. Yes, the shadows of doubt were lengthening, but the pattern was not yet complete. That evening, as twilight settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her window, her garden neat and peaceful beneath her gaze. Yet, her mind dwelt not on roses or hollyhocks, but on human nature. Greed, pride, love, resentment, all were threads in the tapestry of life, and in every village, great or small, they were woven just the same. And somewhere within that tapestry lay the hand that had reached into a locked drawer, broken a seal of red wax, and carried away a man's last testament. Miss Marple, her knitting needles resting at last in her lap, whispered softly to herself, "Shadows of doubt, yes, but shadows give way to light, if one only waits and watches." Chapter 5. Whispers and Red Herrings. It was on the third morning after the Reverend's death that the air in St. Mary Mead grew thick with whispers. News travels quickly in small villages, and rumors swifter still, like ivy climbing unchecked up a garden wall. By breakfast time, half the parish seemed to know that Henry Harrow had been seen in the vicarage garden late on the night of his uncle's passing. By tea time, the other half had convinced itself that he had broken into the Reverend's study and made off with the will. Miss Marple, sitting in her little parlor, listened to the tale retold by her faithful maid Florence, who had gathered it from Mrs. Price's niece at the butcher's. "Bold as brass he was," Florence said breathlessly. "Slipped through the back gate like a thief, and into the Reverend's study he went. Came out a quarter of an hour later looking white as a sheet, and the very next morning no will to be found. Well, if that don't say it all, I don't know what does." Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, raised her eyes. "It says a great deal, Florence, but perhaps not all that you suppose. Village tongues, you know, are very fond of embroidery. One must examine the fabric carefully to see what is truly woven in." Florence sniffed, unconvinced. "Well, I only say what I heard, ma'am, and there's many would agree with me. Blood will tell, they say, and Mr. Henry's blood always did run a little wild." Later that morning, Miss Marple encountered Henry himself on the high street. He was a tall man, fair-haired, but worn about the eyes, as though life had dealt him more cares than pleasures. He greeted her with forced heartiness, though the tremor in his hand betrayed unease. "Ah, Miss Marple, you've heard the gossip, no doubt. Dreadful stuff. They'll have me tried and hanged in the village square before long." Miss Marple gave him a kindly but steady look. "Idle talk has undone many a man, Mr. Harrow, though seldom without a little fuel to feed it. Were you at the vicarage that night?" Henry hesitated only a fraction too long. I may have stepped into the garden, yes," declared Mr. Sims, the blacksmith. "He's done it to cover his debts. London gambling, that's what it is. Stripped the poor Reverend of his savings, and now he means to snatch the estate as well." Others nodded. Only Mr. Davis, the innkeeper, offered a different view. "Well, and what about that widow Carstone? She's been thick as cream with the curate, hasn't she? If the Reverend left all to young Fielding, she'd have him under her thumb in no time. Perhaps she thought to rid herself of the document, eh?" This suggestion caused a ripple of interest, and soon the village had two camps, one crying Henry, the other Lydia. Such divisions are common in country places. They give occupation to idle minds. Miss Marple, however, was not so easily swayed. She paid a call upon Mrs. Carstone the next afternoon, bringing with her a pot of marmalade. The widow received her in her drawing room, where the curtains were drawn against the glare, and a faint perfume of roses lingered in the air. "My dear Miss Marple," she said warmly, "how kind of you to visit. I declare, one feels quite besieged these days. Everywhere I turn, whispers. It is most uncharitable." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Whispers are seldom charitable, dear, but they do not blow without some breeze to stir them. Forgive me if I speak plainly, Mrs. Carstone, but it is said you had a particular interest in the Reverend's will." The widow's eyes widened in well-feigned surprise. "I, my dear lady, what possible interest could I have? The Reverend was no relation of mine. If he chose to leave his estate to Mr. Fielding, that is between them. I only ever wished to support the parish." Miss Marple regarded her steadily. "And Mr. Fielding? You are fond of him, I think." Mrs. Carstone colored slightly. "He is a good man, too good perhaps for this world. He lacks confidence, and if I can bolster him, why should I not? But fondness, Miss Marple, is not the same as ambition. I assure you, I have all I need." Her tone was persuasive, her manner gracious. But Miss Marple had lived too long to be entirely discarded, unless someone wished to create confusion. For in her long experience, Miss Marple had learned that false trails are often laid by the very hands that fear discovery. This fragment might point back toward Henry, but it might equally well be bait. Later, when Miss Marple set the scrap aside and poured herself her evening tea, she reflected. Red herrings are as common in life as in the fishmonger's. One must be careful not to swallow them whole. And as she sipped, the clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking the slow unraveling of the mystery that bound the little village in whispers and doubt. Chapter 6. A Thread in the Tangle. Miss Marple was never one to hurry. She had found in her long life that truth revealed itself best not to those who chased it, but to those who observed quietly, as one watches a skein of wool slowly unroll to show its pattern. Yet even she, with her patience, felt the need to act. Too many threads now tangled about the Reverend's vanished will, and the village was restless with suspicion. She began with what she liked best, a visit to Mrs. Price. The housekeeper, pale from sleepless nights, received Miss Marple in the kitchen, where the scent of drying lavender hung in the air. "My dear," Miss Marple said kindly, settling herself at the table, "you must not let yourself be overwrought. Tell me, have you noticed anything missing from the study besides the will?" Mrs. Price wrung her hands. "No, ma'am, nothing at all. Everything else is as it was. The Reverend was always tidy, his papers neat as pins, only that one envelope gone, and the drawer forced. Miss Marple nodded. And the scrap of parchment you found, it was in the wastebasket? Yes, ma'am, crumpled down among old sermons. I swear it was not there the day before. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though she kept her tone gentle. Then perhaps it was placed there after the Reverend's death. Mrs. Price gasped. You mean someone tried to trick us? Miss Marple patted her hand. People are very seldom so wicked as to destroy an entire truth. But they are often tempted to obscure it just enough to mislead. I dare say that, said in a low voice. It is the gossip, Miss Marple. They say I knew of the will, and it is true. But I did not speak of it to anyone save the Reverend. And now I feel responsible, as though my knowledge has somehow condemned me. Miss Marple studied his pale face. You need not feel so, unless there is something else you have concealed. Mr. Fielding flushed scarlet. I only wish to serve the parish. Mrs. Carstone presses her kindness upon me, but I never encouraged it. I admired the Reverend greatly. If he truly meant to help me in his will, I could only accept it as a duty to continue his work. But, I swear, Miss Marple, I never saw that document. His words rang sincere. But Miss Marple, who had heard sincerity in guilty mouths before, tucked the impression quietly away. It was as she left the church that the clue appeared, small, domestic, easily missed. Near the vestry door lay a crumpled handkerchief, partly caught beneath a mat. Miss Marple stooped, picked it up and smoothed it with practiced fingers. It was a fine piece of lawn, delicately embroidered with the initials L.C. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Lydia Carstone. Had the widow dropped it during one of her many visits to the curate? Quite possible. Yet the vestry was not where she usually lingered. Why then should her handkerchief be here? And on the very day after the will had vanished. She slipped it quietly into her reticule and walked homeward deep in thought. That evening, over tea with Mrs. Bantry, she drew out the handkerchief. My dear Dolly, she asked mildly, would you say this belongs to Mrs. Carstone? Mrs. Bantry peered at it eagerly. Why, yes, it must. Lydia is forever showing off her embroidery. Says it soothes her nerves. But why do you ask? Have you found it? Miss Marple smiled. One might say it found me. In the vestry this morning. Mrs. Bantry gave a little gasp. Mary, do you mean she? Oh, how delicious. I knew she was too interested in that curate. She must have gone there at night, searching the study per— So sure, Arthur. It seems too pat, don't you think? Too much like one of those novels Mary reads. Convenient clues lying about for anyone to pick up. No, if you ask me, Henry's still the guilty one. Miss Marple said nothing. She only sipped her tea and watched the steam curl upward like a question mark. That evening, in her own quiet parlor, she laid out her notes. She wrote, Henry. Quarrel. Debt. Midnight in garden. Lydia. Handkerchief in vestry. Fielding. Nervous, guilty look, yet sincere words. Price. Overheard quarrel. Found scrap of will. Solicitor. Note to be opened if will destroyed. Then she underlined two phrases. Scrap planted and handkerchief. Too convenient? She sat back, her eyes narrowing. It was in her experience that the most obvious clue was very seldom the truest. Villains, like fishermen, love to throw herrings into the stream. She murmured to herself, Yes, too convenient by half, which means the truth lies beneath. Outside, the church bell tolled softly in the night air, and the village of St. Mary Mead settled once more into uneasy slumber. But Miss Marple, her needles clicking in the quiet, knew that she had plucked the first real thread from the tangle. And once a thread is pulled, the whole fabric may yet come undone. Chapter 7. Whispers at Dusk. It was in Miss Marple's experience that truth often declared itself not in broad daylight, but in the gentle murmur of dusk, when tongues grew looser and inhibitions less firm. And so she resolved, after her discovery of Mrs. Carstone's handkerchief, to listen a little more closely to the voices of St. Mary Mead. The day was soft with drizzle, a thin autumn rain that blurred the edges of cottages and hedgerows. Miss Marple wrapped herself in her old blue shawl and made her way to the post office, ostensibly to collect a letter from her niece. In truth, she wished to hear what the village had to say. Inside, not as neat as the Reverend was, she remarked gently. Fielding colored. No, I fear not. He was meticulous in all things. I, alas, am less so. Yet I try to keep his spirit alive in this place. Miss Marple's eyes drifted over the desk. Among the papers lay a blotter, the surface of which bore faint impressions. She leaned closer under the pretext of adjusting her spectacles. Yes, she could just discern the outline of words. One phrase struck clear. Alteration to existing will. Her eyes brightened. She straightened, her voice mild. I often think the smallest things tell us most. One must look closely at details. Fielding smiled weakly, not catching her meaning. When she left, dusk had fallen. She walked slowly, listening to the rustle of hedges, the distant bark of a dog. And then, as she passed the lane near the Carstone house, she heard voices carried on the damp air. You promised me, a woman's voice whispered fiercely. Lydia Carstone. I told you it is dangerous to speak so, came the low reply. It was unmistakably Henry. Miss Marple paused, sheltered by the hedgerow. Their words reached her in fragments. Must be grateful, Lydia said. Not worth the risk, Henry muttered. You owe me, Lydia hissed. Then silence, followed by the sharp sound of a door closing. Miss Marple slipped quietly away, her heart beating faster than her years would suggest. A secret alliance, then, or at least some understanding between Henry and Lydia. But of what nature? She did not yet know. The next morning she invited Mrs. Bantry to tea. Her old friend, robust and curious as always, listened avidly as Miss Marple recounted the overheard exchange. My dear, it's plain as day, Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. They're in it together. Lydia wants the curate for herself, and Henry wants money. Between them, they've spirited away the will. Miss Marple shook her head. Things are seldom so simple. Consider, Dolly, if they worked together, why leave evidence so clumsily behind? It seems the Reverend valued her loyalty. If she were named, it would surprise no one. But it complicates matters. For if word has spread that she might benefit, suspicion may fall upon her too. Miss Marple resumed her knitting slowly. Yes, suspicion indeed. Yet Mrs. Price strikes me as the least worldly of creatures. And yet, she looked thoughtfully at her work. Even the simplest hearts may feel temptation when they believe they have been wronged. That night she pondered long. Henry and Lydia, too obvious. Fielding, too nervous, but perhaps too sincere. Mrs. Price, faithful yet possibly overlooked, and somewhere among them, a hand had stolen the will. It was the next day, while speaking with Mrs. Price in the garden, that Miss Marple noticed something small. The housekeeper bent to pick herbs, and from her apron pocket slipped a folded slip of paper. Miss Marple, ever sharp-eyed, saw the edge before Mrs. Price hastily tucked it back. Her voice remained mild. "You have something tucked away, dear?" Mrs. Price flushed crimson. "Oh, it's nothing, ma'am. Only a note the Reverend left me once. I keep it near for comfort." Miss Marple said nothing, but her heart stirred. A note from the Reverend. Was it truly sentimental or something more? Later at home she reflected. Pieces moved in her mind like figures on a chessboard. The Reverend had wished to reward Mrs. Price. Lydia and Henry had been overheard whispering. Fielding bore impressions of alterations upon his blotter, and yet the false clue of the parchment remained the most telling. "Someone," she murmured to herself, "wants us all to follow the wrong trail, which means the true trail lies somewhere humble, somewhere no one has yet thought to look." Her eyes strayed to the basket of wool at her feet, a skein of yarn, so easily tangled if pulled too hastily. But if one found the right thread and drew it gently, yes, the tangle was beginning to loosen. That evening, as dusk fell once more, Miss Marple walked past the churchyard and paused by the study window. There in the fading light, she saw Miss scurries out. And so, with the Reverend Harrow's missing will, she determined to wait and to set the smallest, neatest of traps. The morning dawned clear and cool, the air scented with wood smoke from early fires. Miss Marple stood by her cottage window, regarding the lane where villagers passed with baskets and bicycles. The ordinary hum of village life was, to her, a kind of music, steady, familiar, and concealing beneath its notes all manner of human secrets. Her plan was simple. She would allow it to be known that she had discovered where the Reverend kept his important papers. It was not strictly true, but truth in its purest form was not always what one needed to uncover deceit. At 11 o'clock she paid a call upon Mrs. Bantry, who welcomed her with coffee and gossip. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, "the whole village is aflutter. Lydia Carstone is scarcely seen. Henry skulks about like a thief, and poor Mr. Fielding looks as though the world will collapse upon his shoulders." "Yes," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "and yet I dare say all will come clear very soon. You know, Dolly, I happen to recall something the Reverend once mentioned to me about his desk in the study. He had a rather unusual habit of hiding important things in plain sight, so very clever of him." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "In plain sight? Good heavens! You don't mean—" Miss Marple shook her head demurely. "Oh no, my dear, I should not say more. Only, well, I have an idea, that is all. But one does not speak of such things too freely. You never know whose ears may be listening." Mrs. Bantry, delighted, promised silence, though Miss Marple knew perfectly well that by tea-time half the village would be buzzing with the news. And that, of course, was precisely what she intended. By the following evening the rumor had indeed taken root. Mrs. Hart at the post office had heard it, as had Mr. Pritchard at the grocer's. Even young Tommy Briggs, who delivered milk, was repeating to his mother that old Miss Marple knows something about the Reverend's papers. It was then that Miss Marple prepared the... She saw movement, a shadow slipping round to the side door of the vicarage. The figure paused, glanced about, then disappeared inside. Miss Marple could not see the face clearly, but she noted the gait, brisk, purposeful, not unlike that of a man accustomed to striding across fields. Her heart gave a small flutter. She waited longer. Presently, the light in the study grew brighter, as if a lamp had been turned up. Through the thin curtains, she could see the silhouette of someone rifling through the desk drawers. The figure bent low, lifted papers, then stilled suddenly, as if reading something with intense care. At last the lamp was extinguished. The figure slipped out, and the door closed softly. Miss Marple, as silently as a cat, followed at a distance. Along the lane the clouds parted, and she saw him clearly for the first time. It was Henry Harrow. He moved quickly, clutching something to his chest. But when Miss Marple reached the corner, he was gone, swallowed by the night. The next morning brought the village into further excitement. Henry had been seen leaving for London on the early train, his suitcase hastily packed. Mrs. Bantry was certain this was evidence of guilt. "My dear Jane," she cried, "surely there can be no doubt now. He has fled with the will." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Fled, perhaps. But guilt, Dolly, is another matter. Running away can mean many things. Sometimes it is innocence pursued by shadows, and sometimes it is guilt itself. One must be careful not to confuse them." Later that day she sought out Mr. Fielding. She found him in the church, his hands clasped nervously as though in prayer. "You are troubled, Mr. Fielding," she said softly. He started, flushing. "Miss Marple, yes, I confess I am troubled. Matters weigh heavily upon me. The parish, the uncertainty, the whispers about me." Miss Marple regarded him keenly. "I dare say it must be difficult, carrying the burden of responsibility. Is all this talk? The will, the Reverend's papers. People eye me strangely, as if I'd any part in such goings-on. But I swear to you I know nothing. Only," she hesitated, her eyes downcast, "only he did once tell me that he would see I was looked after. That is all." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Yes, dear, and perhaps he meant it. But meaning is one thing and paper is another. The question is, whose hands have meddled with that paper?" As dusk fell once more, Miss Marple sat in her parlor knitting. The trap had been sprung, and Henry had taken the bait. But in her mind a clearer picture was forming. Someone had planted the false parchment in the Reverend's study. Someone had whispered about Lydia, had allowed Henry to overhear promises, had left trails too visible. And now Henry, desperate and impulsive, had walked straight into her net. Yet Miss Marple was not satisfied. For while Henry might be guilty of panic and folly, she sensed that another, cooler hand had set the pieces upon the board. She gazed thoughtfully at her knitting. The pattern was intricate, full of tiny twists and turns. But the thread ran unbroken from beginning to end. So it was with this mystery. An unbroken thread linked all the players. And Miss Marple, with patient fingers, was following it inch by inch. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would call them all together. It was time the last tangles were undone. Chapter 9. The Revelation. The drawing-room of the vicarage had not seen such solemnity since the late Reverend Harrow had held parish meetings there. The lamps glowed softly, casting gentle light on the assembled faces, each taut with unease and curiosity. Miss Marple sat in the high-backed chair by the hearth, her knitting in her lap, though her needles were still. She looked for all the world like a kindly old lady, ready to dispense advice on jam making. Yet her blue eyes were keen, bright as candle flames. Before her the suspects waited. Henry Harrow, pale and restless, pacing occasionally before dropping into a chair, only to rise again. Lydia Carr, by all means, Miss Marple, pull away. For I've been accused enough already. Let us have it out. Miss Marple's gaze rested on him briefly. And you shall, Mr. Harrow. But I beg your patience. One must untangle knots carefully, or the whole skein may break. She turned her eyes upon the group. We must begin at the beginning. The Reverend Harrow was a man of order, of piety, and of kindness. He had made a will long ago, leaving the bulk of his estate to his son. Yet in recent months he grew uncertain of Henry's capacity and was inclined toward other arrangements. He confided as much to several people, enough, I fear, to set in motion certain designs. Henry flushed. He doubted me, yes, but I swear I never sought to harm his plans. Miss Marple inclined her head. I believe you, Henry. You are impulsive, reckless perhaps, but not cunning. Your dash to London, however unwise, was more panic than guilt. Henry sank back into his chair, relief and shame mingling. Miss Marple continued. Now, as to the missing will, we have seen a number of false trails. First, the quarrel in the garden between Lydia and the Reverend, overheard by Mr. Fielding. It was meant to suggest that Lydia had reason to destroy a will. Then came the handkerchief, so conveniently left behind, embroidered with Lydia's initials. Too convenient, I think. And finally, Henry's midnight visit to the vicarage, where he rifled drawers in desperation, believing the papers might still be found. She paused, letting her words sink in. Lydia spoke, her voice tight. So you say I have been framed? By whom, pray? For I have suffered whispers enough. Miss Marple regarded her kindly. Yes, my dear, you have. But let us not leap. The truth reveals itself in small observations. Consider the parchment found in the Reverend's study, the so-called fragment of a will. Its ink was faint, its phrasing suspicious. It was, in short, a forgery, left there for discovery. Who would do such a thing? Not Henry, who is too clumsy. Not you, Lydia, who would not dare. And not Mrs. Price, who lacks guile so intimately. Who but the solicitor could create a fragment that might deceive, at least at first glance? And who, moreover, had most to lose if the Reverend altered his will and sought the advice of another man of law? Lydia gasped. You mean he stood to gain from keeping the will hidden? Indeed, said Miss Marple. For the Reverend had confided his intention of appointing a new trustee, one outside Mr. Jarvis's sphere. He even considered leaving provision for Mrs. Price, something quite beyond the solicitor's knowledge or control. Such independence would have lessened Jarvis's influence, and so he acted. Jarvis laughed harshly. Nonsense. All conjecture. Miss Marple smiled gently. Conjecture is not proof, Mr. Jarvis. But proof, too, is at hand. You see, when I hinted that the Reverend kept important papers hidden in plain sight, I observed who reacted. Henry grew restless, Lydia alarmed, Mrs. Price fearful. But you, Mr. Jarvis, you alone betrayed calculation. Your eyes narrowed, your lips pressed tight. You were not worried about discovery. You were considering whether I had found the very document you sought to suppress. The solicitor's face hardened. This is trickery, nothing more. Miss Marple's needles clicked once as she picked them up, calm as ever. Trickery, perhaps. But I have more. Last night I placed a small mark, a smudge of chalk upon the drawer where the Reverend's papers had once lain. This morning, before anyone else entered, I checked. The chalk had been disturbed. And who visited the vicarage first today? None other than you, Mr. Jarvis, under the pretext of advising Mr. Fielding. All eyes turned to Jarvis. His mouth opened, then closed. His heavy hands gripped the arms of his chair. You cannot prove it, he muttered. Miss Marple's smile was faint but firm. On the contrary, I think the true will may yet be found. You would not destroy it, Mr. Jarvis. A solicitor knows better. Too dangerous. Knew that guile might surround him. And he entrusted it not to the clever, but to the faithful. A silence fell. Jarvis sat rigid, his face drained of color. It is over, Mr. Jarvis, Miss Marple said softly. Your schemes have failed. The Reverend's will is found, and his wishes shall be honored. You sought to cast suspicion upon others, upon Lydia, upon Henry. But in the end, the simplest observation betrayed you. The solicitor rose abruptly, his voice hoarse. This is intolerable. He strode to the door, but Mr. Fielding barred his way, trembling but resolute. Miss Marple folded the will neatly and placed it upon the table. There, my dears, she said, her voice warm once more. The truth is laid bare. And tomorrow, in the proper light of day, all shall be settled before the law. For now let us be at peace. She resumed her knitting, the needles clicking softly. The others sat in stunned quiet, the clock ticking steadily in the room that had held so much uncertainty. And at last, in the calm voice of an old lady who had seen much and understood more, Miss Marple brought the tangled skein to its rightful end. Chapter 10. Tea, Truth, and Tranquility. The next morning dawned with a crisp clearness, the sort of autumnal sunlight that slanted through the panes of St. Mary Mead cottages and turned every bead of dew into a glittering gem. The village, though still abuzz with whispers of Reverend Harrow's will, had a calmness about it now, a sense that the turbulence of suspicion was finally settling. Miss Marple, having risen early, set her lace curtains just so, arranged her best china on the small oak table, and waited for her morning callers. It was not unusual for her to host neighbors for tea, but today the gathering carried with it a sense of purpose. For there was a matter to be tidily wrapped up, as she liked to say, like darning a sock properly, so that not a hole is left to show. At precisely 10:30, the first knock crackling merrily in the grate, Miss Marple began in her soft, deliberate tones. My dear friends, she said, pouring a careful stream of tea, the truth, once revealed, often seems quite obvious. But until then, it hides itself very neatly in the folds of ordinary life. Reverend Harrow's will was not merely a legal document. It was a key to understanding motives, fears, and alas, crimes. Let us go through matters step by step so that nothing remains cloudy. She set her teacup down with a delicate clink. Reverend Harrow, she began, was a man of conscience, but also of foresight. He feared greed might undo his household after his passing. Thus, his will was written with careful stipulations, though not all were known at once. The condition that shocked everyone, that the estate would be left not to family alone but to fund a small charitable trust, was, I suspect, his attempt to temper ambition with service. Unfortunately, secrecy breeds resentment. Inspector Craddock leaned forward, and that resentment led directly to murder. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, knitting needles now flashing between her fingers as naturally as breathing. At first, each of you appeared to have reason. Mrs. Harrow, the widow, though outwardly dignified, was suddenly faced with uncertainty. Dr. Pembroke feared his patronage withdrawn. Arthur was desperate to secure his future with Miss Elaine, fearing she would not marry him without means. And Beatrice, well, poor girl, you were frightened into silence about things you noticed. Beatrice blushed crimson, but Miss Marple patted her hand kindly. You did very well, my dear, once courage took hold. It was you who saw Mrs. Harrow leave the study late at night, which muddled the inspector considerably. Craddock muttered, "Yes, indeed," while Mrs. Harrow sighed softly, admitting, "I only went in to pray by his desk, Miss Marple. I touched nothing." "And that was quite true," Miss Marple said gently. "But the real culprit was far cleverer than we first supposed. Too clever by further." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Poison in the brandy decanter, kept for special occasions. He knew the Reverend would take a tot while in solemn discussion. It was quick and easily disguised as natural failure of the heart." Mrs. Harrow gasped. "But the will?" Miss Marple nodded gravely. Graves attempted to ensure the fraudulent addendum would surface later, once suspicions had cooled. But what he had not reckoned with was Reverend Harrow's meticulous nature. The true will was locked away, too carefully for Graves to access immediately. In his haste, Graves left contradictions behind. Dates that did not match, ink of a different batch, and a missing line from the Reverend's own peculiar phraseology. The good of souls outweighs the weight of gold. She looked over her knitting at them all. That phrase was absent in the addendum. I knew at once it could not be the Reverend's hand. A small thing, you see, but crucial. Arthur sat forward wide-eyed. "And my quarrel with him? He was not angry about my wish to marry Elaine?" "No, dear boy," Miss Marple said kindly. "He was only concerned you not fall prey to the very greed that ensnared Graves. Your love was never doubted. It was money that clouded your vision, not affection." Arthur flushed deeply, relief and shame mingling on his face. Dr. Pembroke cleared his throat. "But Miss Marple, how did you prove Graves's guilt? A phrase in a will is damning in logic, yes, but not in court." "Ah, the proof," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking faster for a moment. "That came from two things. First, the decanter. The residue of digitalis, faint but there, matched to Graves's own prescription file. He had been acquiring it under false pretense. And second, the handkerchief he dropped, stained faintly with the Reverend's spilt brandy. It bore the embroidery of his initials. Such little things, Inspector, are what murderers forget." Craddock let out a low whistle. "I dare say you'd make half the force redundant, Miss Marple." "Oh no," she said. "Hardship," Miss Marple said with a twinkle. "They often bring out the best in young couples. Far better than too much wealth, which, like overwatering a rose, can rot the roots." Laughter rippled through the room, easing the last of the tension. The tea was poured afresh, scones passed around, and conversation drifted to gentler topics: the state of the churchyard roses, the coming harvest supper, and Mrs. Price Ridley's latest outrage at the Women's Institute. As the gathering broke up, Inspector Craddock lingered by the door. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "you've once again reminded me that crime is not all London's dark alleys and gangs. Sometimes it's tea rooms and vicars' wills. I'll not forget it." She looked up at him with her serene blue eyes. "Human nature, Inspector, is much the same everywhere. Only the scenery differs." When they had all gone, and the house was quiet save for the ticking clock and the purring of her cat, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and allowed herself a small sigh of satisfaction. The Reverend's memory was vindicated, the village peace restored, and justice quietly served. Not with fanfare, but with truth. She poured herself one last cup of tea, sat back in her armchair, and gazed out at the tidy garden where chrysanthemums bobbed gently in the autumn breeze. Life in St. Mary Mead would march on as always. Whispers, scandals, harvests, and hymn singing. And she, Jane Marple, would continue to sit at the heart of it, watchful, gentle, but ever discerning. For though wickedness lurked in the most unexpected places, so too did goodness, and she trusted in both to balance one another out. And with that thought, Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, as the church bells of St. Mary Mead began to toll 11, solemn and steady, over the peaceful English village.